Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, September 21st, 2017. I have not always agreed with Colin Powell, the retired general and former Secretary of State in the first term of the George W. Bush administration. But yesterday in Ann Arbor, in a talk he gave at the University of Michigan, Colin Powell gave some really good advice. He said, let's not go crazy every time North Korea shoots missiles. Start ignoring them, and maybe you can find a different way to solve this. It would probably drive them crazy if we ignored one of their launches and after the media interest went away, it would die down. Now, this echoes what I've been saying for months, and perhaps this advice is a little too late. I will acknowledge that. But Donald Trump was unable to resist the temptation to respond to the provocations and bullying of Kim Jong-un. And so he issued his fire and brimstone threat. Now he's at the United Nations. We'll get to the new sanctions in just a moment. But I have long argued that what Kim Jong-un wants most is attention. And if you deny it, he might seek other ways of trying to get that attention. And Powell is a rational player. He said North Korea would be committing suicide if they use nuclear weapons. There is no strategic advantage to North Korea to destroy two neighborhoods in San Francisco. Hey, thanks for using my town as your example, General Powell. He went on, it does nothing for them. He thinks China will keep North Korea in check. They don't want a war because it would destabilize the region and destabilize China. If there was a war, North Koreans would flee, and where would they have to go? There would be thousands heading into China. It's far past time for the nations of the world to confront Kim Jong-un and say that Kim's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons poses a threat to the entire world with an unthinkable loss of human life. That's what Trump told world leaders. And then, of course, he referred to Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man. And while Powell was dignified and didn't actually mention Trump by name, he said one of the problems we're having now in our foreign policy is that we're spending too much time insulting people. Diplomacy is listening to what the other guy needs, preserving your own position, but listening to the other guy. We need to lower the temperature, he said. So I agree with Colin Powell. And I want to thank Merle. Merle lives in Royal Oak, Michigan, outside Detroit. And he fills my email box on almost a daily basis with great news tips. This was one of them from the Detroit Free Press. And I think that it is a note of sanity in a world dominated by madness. Oh, and let's get to the madness. Trump announced at the UN today new sanctions on North Korea. I'm announcing a new executive order to sign that significantly expands authorities to target individuals, companies, financial institutions that finance and facilitate trade with North Korea. Trump said the order will target any individual or entity that conducts trade in goods, services, or technology with North Korea. Well, it sounds good. He also noted that China announced earlier in the day that their central bank had informed its subordinates to stop working with North Korean counterparts. But these sanctions are always very leaky. There are many ways around them, and devious traders of various flags will do so. Now, Trump is also having a series of meetings, a three-way, with the new leader of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, and Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Then he's got a separate meeting with Abe, who is seen as more in sync with Trump on the bluff, bluster, and threaten annihilation front, where Moon is described by Trump, or has been described, as an appeaser, because he fears a military exchange with North Korea and the massive loss of life that it would likely produce. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Moon said in his speech at the UN following Trump's, "All of our endeavors are to prevent the outbreak of war from breaking out." Now, that's a little redundant. We'll blame translators for that, okay? In that respect, the situation surrounding the North Korean nuclear issue needs to be managed stably. Yes, stably. And stability is not something you consider a trait of the Trumpster. So the tensions will not be become overly intensified, or accidental military clashes will not destroy peace. And I think that is a notable concern. And a spokesman, the foreign minister of North Korea, Ri Yong-ho, said, "Back home we have a saying, the dog barks, but the caravan continues. If Trump thought he could scare us with the noise of a dog barking, well, he should be daydreaming." Meanwhile, Trump also demonized Iran in his lengthy speech the other day. And yesterday he hinted that he's already made up his mind about what's going to happen in mid-October, the next trigger date for U.S. certification of Iran's compliance with the agreement. And what he is signaling is that he wants to move the goalposts. And he wants to do that by imposing new terms unilaterally on Iran. He is not dangling any inducements or any concessions. He's not putting anything on the table. He's just saying that we need to extend this agreement in terms of time, and that we need to expand it to include areas that were never on the table in the six-party talks with Iran that took place several years ago. So the Iranians have further comments. "We see today the Americans are seeking an excuse to break this agreement." And he said for that reason, negotiating with an American government that tramples on a legal agreement would be a waste of time. And so I consider this a fool's errand, and it is on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who has somehow induced Trump, like he did Obama, like he did Bush too. Netanyahu has managed to get the United States to adopt the key elements of Israel's foreign policy and pretend that they're our own. And what Trump is trying to do is going to only gum up the works. And as we pointed out yesterday, David Sanger's commentary in the New York Times, the model used here for Iran, if the U.S. walks away from this agreement or undermines it in a significant way, it sends a major signal to North Korea that there is no deal available, and that confrontation is the most reliable route. So if Trump, on October 15th, fails to certify that Iran is complying with the deal, then the Congress has 60 days to reimpose sanctions, and if they do, that would mean an end to the agreement, at least for the United States. And the idea that this can be renegotiated so far after the fact, I think, is a pipe dream of the guy who believes that he is the world's greatest deal maker. And Macron of France, the new prime minister, he's president, Emmanuel Macron, he favors keeping the agreement because it's a good one, but in a tip of the hat to Trump, he says that he would support adding 2 or 3 other provisions. I think these people really underestimate the Iranians. And Rouhani has demanded an apology from Trump. He said the nuclear agreement cannot be amended, reopened, or renegotiated. And given Trump's open hostility, he said it's not realistic. And that he then threatened what is the obvious bluff that Iran has been running for years, which is, well, maybe we'll just restart enrichment of uranium. So it's a messy, messy situation. And I am delighted to hear, via an exclusive interview with The Intercept, that Senator Bernie Sanders is finally offering more detail about his foreign policy. One of my big critiques of the Sanders campaign in 2016 is the most he said about foreign policy was that he opposed the war against Iraq in 2003 and Hillary didn't, and he had vague criticisms of regime change wars. But he was silent on most of the critical issues, including the conflict between Israel and Palestine, including Saudi Arabia's role in fomenting various elements of the Syrian conflict. So in the interview with The Intercept, Sanders broke with the bipartisan consensus in Congress, and he said that he has long considered, the United States has long considered Saudi Arabia to be a loyal friend. He said, I consider Saudi Arabia to be an undemocratic country that has supported terrorism around the world. It has funded terrorism. They are not an ally of the United States. Well, that's really clear and very frank and very true. Sanders went on to say he accused the incredibly anti-democratic Saudis of continuing to fund madrasas, spreading an extremely radical Wahhabi doctrine in many countries around the world. Now, this is a start, Bernie, because the Saudis are the principal funder of many of the so-called militant groups in Syria. The Saudis are fighting a hot war in Yemen that the U.S. fully supports, and we falsely claim that Iran is directly involved in that conflict as just part of the fog that we try to create around the Persian Gulf. So Sanders called for a rethink in terms of American foreign policy of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And related to the Saudis, he said, they have played a very bad role internationally, but we have sided with them time and time and time again. And yet Iran, which just held elections, Iran, whose young people really want to reach out to the West, we are continuing to put them down. Now, he added that he has legitimate concerns about Iran's foreign policy, but wants a more even-handed approach from the U.S. to the Iran and Saudi conflict. Now, here's where he even went deeper. And I've told this story before, that over 10 years ago, I was substituting for Tom Hartman on his daily radio show. Hartman had a Friday weekly segment, Brunch with Bernie. Before we went on the air together, I told Bernie I wanted to open up by asking about recent news about Israel and Palestine, and he flatly refused. He said, I don't want to talk about that. Well, here's what he had to say to The Intercept. And there is a foreign policy speech he's planning to give in Fulton, Missouri today, which will say that the United States is complicit in Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. He would be willing to consider voting to cut off U.S. aid to the Jewish state. He also offered tentative support for a face-to-face meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. He described U.S. drone strikes against innocent civilians as one of the root causes of terrorism. He called for re-examination of U.S. foreign policy's unilateralism. And on a separate issue, when he was asked about Donald Trump and whether he is a white supremacist, well, he used his own words. He said, I think Trump has strong racist tendencies, and I say that not just because of his absurd and horrific remarks on Charlottesville, but because when you lead the effort to try to delegitimize the first African-American president in our history, I think that's racist. When you argue about the Central Park Five, I think that's racist. So I think it's fair to say he has strong racist tendencies. That was a very diplomatic response, but not one that had no content. Well, we have more leaks coming out of Washington. The Mueller special counsel investigation at the Justice Department. A lot of it is centered on Paul Manafort and his contacts, we're told, again based on leaks, that Manafort, while he was working as Trump's campaign manager in early July last year, offered to provide briefings on the state of the election to a Russian billionaire with links to the Kremlin. The Washington Post, again citing unnamed sources, said Manafort had made the offer in an email to an intermediary whom he asked to relay the message to Oleg Deripaska, an aluminum magnate with whom Manafort had done business, and they have a dispute centering around millions of dollars that it appears Manafort was trying to resolve by offering to provide even private briefings. So this is, again, based on leaks, but it is quite incriminating for Paul Manafort. But I suspect that it has more to do with his own greed, his own desire to use his position to enhance his personal wealth. He reportedly talked about this could make him whole and perhaps resolve the financial dispute with Deripaska. But again, this is based on leaks, and it is not, in my view, evidence of direct collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia for the purposes of meddling in or manipulating our election. This appears to be Manafort looking out for Manafort. And keep in mind, this has always been curious to me, Manafort, who has an apartment in Trump Tower and then went upstairs to work for the Trump campaign, he worked for Trump for free. Yes, as a volunteer. And I'm not sure why that would be. You know, Trump is, he talks about how rich he is, even though he's a real cheapskate. And why would Manafort agree to work for free? Well, perhaps he felt he could profit from it in other ways, and so he didn't need to draw a salary from the Trump campaign. We're also learning from the New York Times, and this is not based on leaks, this is based on actual sources, that Manafort is currently working for the Iraqi Kurds, supporting their referendum for Kurdish independence, which is scheduled to take place this coming Monday. Now, as you probably know, the U.S. opposes Kurdish independence. They oppose this referendum, and it's simply backing the government in Baghdad and bowing down to the demands of Turkey and indirectly Iran. But I support not Manafort's work, but I support the aspirations for independence of the Kurds in the region. And so this is interesting. We don't know what, if anything, the fees are for Manafort's advice to the Kurdish leadership. Clearly, they hired him on the basis of his ties to Trump and their perception that Manafort would be able to grease the way to get Trump to either go neutral or support the independence aspirations of the Kurds. So this is interesting. It shows that Manafort will work for people who are not supported by the United States, and this goes back to the work he did for Yanukovych in Ukraine. And Yanukovych was a corrupt guy who nevertheless was apparently elected in a fair election. And the U.S. demonizes him as a corrupt dictator, a kleptocrat, and justifies the coup that we supported that took him down. And we know from the leaks yesterday, at least we are led to believe, that Manafort was the subject of a FISA court wiretap warrant that began in 2014 that would have been related to his work for Yanukovych, maybe his other project with Deripaska. But so far, none of this directly links to Trump or the Trump campaign. And I'm willing to wait and see where the evidence leads. Meanwhile, related to the Kurds and the referendum coming up, the public television news hour the other night featured an interview with Turkey's maximum leader, Recep Erdogan. And Erdogan made it very clear that Turkey virulently opposes the U.S. support for Kurdish militia groups in Iraq and Syria, and in what everyone hopes is the final stage of the battle against the Islamic State and the recovery of Mosul, which has taken place, and Raqqa, which is envisioned in the near future, the end game comes into play. And Erdogan is bitter that the United States has paid and given weapons to these Kurdish fighters and won't sell certain weapons to Turkey. That's why he made a deal with Russia for surface-to-air missiles recently. But I hope that you can never expect what Trump will do, but I hope the Trump administration will not take the counsel of the strongman Erdogan from Turkey. Every day I like to take a minute and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Got a renewed annual subscription from Mitchell Kadish in Southern California yesterday. Thank you, Mitch. Also, Linda Gray, Steve Wazensky, and Judy Holloway are reliable monthly supporters of the Peter B. Collins podcast. I invite you to join them. All you have to do is click on peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and that takes you to the sign-up page where you have options. And if you're like Mitch, you take out a new annual subscription in the continental U.S., I will send you a bonus book of your choice. They are displayed on the sign-up page. It's been reported that Facebook is blocking posts of people who put up information or express support or sympathy for the armed resistance in Myanmar. These are it's apparently a pretty small group of armed individuals who call themselves the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ARSA. Now, I am not an expert on Myanmar, the history of the conflict between the majority Hindus and the minority Muslim Rohingya. But the recent events are clear that because of the long-running discrimination, ARSA fighters did get into conflicts with the military of Myanmar, Burma. But the response has been so disproportionate, with villages being burned, ethnic cleansing is underway. There have been just random killings of males, typically. Women have been raped, many raped in a public way to send that ugly message. And over 400,000 people have been forced across the border into Bangladesh, where they are now mired in monsoon rains in what amount to prison camps. And for Facebook to respond to a request from the government of Myanmar and block any post related to ARSA, well, I think that is a violation of my freedom of speech and my access to a variety of information from different sides of this conflict. Here in the United States, the battle is going to lead to a vote sometime in the Senate next week, the last-ditch effort to just blow up Obamacare, and the project by Lindsey Graham and Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana is as ugly as the previous attempts. It will harm many people. This one will create a bizarre patchwork of 50 different state-level health insurance programs and only give the states 2 years to create the framework to accept these block grants and decide how to spend the money state by state. And we know that in some states, it will not be used to give insurance coverage of Medicaid type to the poor. It will be used in ways that benefit the people who donate money to the Republican Party. So this is a very dangerous package. It also, while Trump claims it does ban any penalties for pre-existing conditions, that is flatly untrue, because in the fine print, the states can request a waiver. And who's going to turn them down? Not any appointee of Donald Trump. But what's interesting is that the profiteers of Obamacare and the overall for-profit health insurance system in the United States are blistering in their opposition to Graham Cassidy. Yesterday, the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association and the lobby group called America's Health Insurance Plans announced their opposition to the bill. The health insurance plans people say the legislation could hurt patients by further destabilizing the individual market and could potentially allow government-controlled single-payer health care to grow. And that's the threat that Republicans, it's like kryptonite, right? So I'm still hopeful that the same pattern and the same blocks of Republicans will prevent this from passing next week. And here's a comment from a guy who claims to be a Democrat but votes with the Republicans all too often, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Now, he's a former governor, and he said the numbers do not work at all for West Virginia, with an older, sicker population and an opioid addiction problem. Yeah, that's where the hillbilly was attached to heroin in reference to OxyContin. As a former governor, I like the concept of block grants because they give you flexibility, but the cuts are deeper than the needs we have, and our needs are greater than the money we would have under the bill. And Jimmy Kimmel, the late-night TV host who I rarely watch, just not my, I don't know, I haven't been attracted to his brand of entertainment. But he has really led the charge to oppose these really deceitful efforts to repeal Obamacare, replace it with something far inferior, and claim just because premiums will be cheaper for shitty coverage that somehow is an improvement. And Kimmel, whose son was born with I believe, a heart defect, has used his own son's case, the pre-existing condition that will follow him for life. And he had Bill Cassidy, the Louisiana senator, on his show, and Cassidy, cozied up to Jimmy Kimmel, saying that he would observe the Jimmy Kimmel rule or test, and Kimmel called him out as a liar. And he deserves it. Over at consortiumnews.com, Bill Binney and Ray McGovern, who are some of the founders of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, they published a new piece regarding the hack versus leak narrative about the DNC servers. A couple of quotes. The ongoing U.S. media campaign against Russia has been so effective that otherwise intelligent people have been unable even to entertain the notion that they may have been totally misled by the intelligence community. The last time this happened, in 2003, after a year of such propaganda, the U.S. attacked Iraq on fraudulent, not mistaken, intelligence. And the VIPS has based its analysis on forensic investigations that, oddly, the FBI has bent over backwards to avoid. We stand by our main conclusion that the data from the intrusion of July 5, 2016, into the Democratic National Committee's computers, blamed on Russian hacking, was not a hack, but rather a download copy onto an external storage device by someone with physical access to the DNC. And they detailed the copying speeds, the transfer rate, which was 22.7 megabytes per second. And Bill Binney, who was the technical director of the NSA, he devised the systems that he now tells us would detect transfer of information from DNC to WikiLeaks, as has been alleged. And they ran tests with networks in Amsterdam and in New Jersey. And they couldn't come up with transfer speeds anywhere close to the 22 megabytes per second. 12 Mbps is as close as they got. And they go on to say, and they're talking about Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe, that these people are intimately familiar with NSA's capabilities and practice with respect to bulk capture and storage of fiber optic communications. Two of us actually devised the system still in use, and Ed Snowden's revelations filled in remaining gaps. Today's NSA is in a position to clear up any and all questions about intrusions into the DNC. And they reiterate that they admonished Barack Obama 3 days before he left office to demand that the NSA cough up any data it had on alleged Russian hacking. And that, to the best of our knowledge, didn't happen. So they close by saying what they call the obvious. All three agencies, the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI, have been aware all along that the NSA has the data. One wonders why it should require a presidential order for them to delve into that data and come up with conclusions based on fact, as compared to the assessments of the very fuzzy intelligence reports of last October and this past January. Cheryl Atkinson is a controversial woman. She worked with CBS News for many years. I regard her as a conservative, and some of her reporting I found objectionable. But at The Hill yesterday, she wrote a piece that I generally agree with, and that is that Trump was, in fact, correct when he tweeted murkily back in March that Obama had ordered wiretaps on Trump Tower. Because we know now, again, based on leaks, we don't have evidence, but it is alleged that Paul Manafort was wiretapped under two different FISA warrants, one from 2014, one from 2016, and he lived at Trump Tower, and in the brief period he worked on the campaign, he worked in Trump Tower. So Atkinson takes it further. If these reports are accurate, it means U.S. intelligence agencies secretly surveilled at least half a dozen Trump associates, including Carter Page and Michael Flynn. She says, "We know this because former Obama advisor Susan Rice reportedly admitted unmasking or learning the identities of those people who were surveilled." And in May, former Director of National Intelligence Clapper, former Acting Attorney General Yates acknowledged that they, too, reviewed communications of political figures secretly collected under President Obama. And she recites the history of Obama-era surveillance. That Clapper lied, we know that. Intel agencies secretly monitored conversations of members of Congress while the Obama administration negotiated the Iran nuclear deal. That's been proven. The CIA got caught spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee, the torture report investigators. That's been proven. She also alleges that there were wiretaps on Dennis Kucinich, the congressman from Ohio, in 2011. I have not seen evidence of that. And she confirms what we know, that Congresswoman Jane Harman, the Democrat from California, was surveilled during the Bush administration. She also reports on her own episode of being surveilled. Cheryl Atkinson's computer was hacked by an unauthorized external unknown party on multiple occasions, and she blames the government. She then reprints a bunch of tweets from CNN, Trump's baseless wiretap claim, and then one from September 18th, exclusive, U.S. government wiretapped former Trump campaign chairman. So Cheryl Atkinson gets a little sweet revenge in this case. There's a great piece today, 2 articles that I'm recommending for you. I've linked to each of them in the show file for today's podcast. One is by Caitlin Johnstone, the Australian, who really is an expert on American politics and the shortcomings of Democrats and alleged progressives. She takes on the Rob Reiner, David Frum new group called the Committee to Investigate Russia. The Morgan Freeman propaganda video that we led our podcast with yesterday, where he falsely asserts that we have been attacked and we are at war. And this is notable because Katie Johnstone can get pretty worked up and drop a lot of F-bombs. If that offends you, there are no F-bombs in today's post from Caitlin Johnstone. And we'll also point out that today Julian Assange posted a tweet that he has never been contacted, nor has WikiLeaks, by the Senate Intelligence Committee or the Mueller Special Counsel investigation. I encourage you to read Katie Johnstone's piece. Yesterday, in my coverage of the Committee to Investigate Russia, I made a significant mistake. I said that James Earl Jones has passed away, and that is not true. I'm not quite sure why I thought that. In my memory, it seemed that perhaps he had gone on to the next life. But I want to thank Carl Howard for pointing out that I got that wrong, and I apologize to the alive and well James Earl Jones. And finally today, I want to recommend another commentary. This is by Stephen Kinzer. He's a former New York Times reporter who now writes columns for the Boston Globe, and he points out that Trump has assembled his own military junta inside the administration, with the former generals Mattis, Kelly, and McMaster. And he compares it to the military juntas in the good old days of Chile, Argentina, Turkey, and Greece, and talks about how, while these generals in some ways kind of impose a certain level of order on Trump, that the role of generals is to take orders and fight wars, not to question the policy, and that could be a very dangerous precedent. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. It's free. You're free to share it with anyone, and we post it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.